Hello there and welcome to our special daily coverage of the Russia-Ukraine file, coming to you live on All 24 News from Algiers with me, Karim Zachary. Here's what's on today. 100 days of a war that is reshaping Europe and the world. A war nobody really believed it would happen, and many analysts concurred. The Russian forces massing on the border were too few to occupy the country, they argued. State media had done little to prepare the Russian public for war. An invasion would trigger economic penalties so ruinous to the Russian economy that no leader would dare risk it. All of this was true, and they were wrong. Surging inflation boosted by higher energy prices as the West disengages from Russian oil and gas supplies has been exacerbated by rising food prices, leading to fears that many of the world's poorest will not be able to afford to feed themselves. The war is battering a global food system weakened by COVID-19, climate change and energy shock. Ukraine's exports of grain and oilseeds have mostly stopped, and Russia's are threatened as well. Russia's initial invasion, the hampered advance into Kiev, the retreat and reorientation of its forces, and the assault now underway in Ukraine's east are the different phases this war witnessed. But what's more to come on the ground, and how effective are the sanctions against Russia to stop the war, and what will Russia do in retaliation, are pressing concerns that are the subject of analysis of our debate show. We will raise some of these concerns and other questions with our panel of guests. I'm joined live via Skype by Mykola Volkievsky, a former advisor to Chairman Committee Parliament of Ukraine from, you guessed it, Ukraine, along with Harley Schlenger, a vice chairman of the Board Shilia Institute from USA. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. A break, and we get down to discussion. On the 100th day of the conflict, as the EU tightened its sanctions against Moscow with a gradual oil embargo, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his regular speech that his country would emerge victorious from the war against Russia.
From Ukraine, where the field is blooming, but her hair is getting gray. From Ukraine that stands and will stand. Ukraine whose glory and freedom have not yet perished. Ukraine to which we say glory, glory to Ukraine, glory to the nation. And everyone knows the next phrase, death to the enemies, because there are three words. We've been fighting for 100 days already after 8 years. Peace, victory, Ukraine, glory to Ukraine.
Let me commence with you, Mr. Mykola Volkievsky. Russia's forces appear to be taking control of the strategically important city of Severodonetsk in Ukraine's east, as more Western allies promise additional missile systems and arms to Kiev. 80% of the city is now in Russian hands. Capturing Severodonetsk would give the Russian President Vladimir Putin control of all Luhansk and the region with Donetsk, which makes up Ukraine's Donbas industrial heartland, consolidating a shift in battlefield momentum after his forces were pushed back from Kiev and northern Ukraine. How likely is the loss of Severodonetsk expected, and how long could the war grind on, taking into consideration the slow rate of Moscow's advance? And are the missile systems sent by Western allies to Ukraine able to regain the lost territories? Or that's just wishful thinking, since the US refuses to send long-range missile system?
Well, first of all, I would like to say we had the 100 days worst day in Ukrainian history since war started 24th of February. Yes, it's true that Russia tried to control the whole territory of Lugansk region. I mentioned it in Lugansk, in the Rubizhne city, even in Severodonetsk, when Ukrainian forces just was fighting against Russia for the last maybe 50 or 55 days. Actually, we don't know how to expect will be the next round of how the Russian will rolling, closer to Lysychansk city. It's also near Severodonetsk in this region. We don't know how to expect how they will, proceed those those fights in this region. But by the way, it was true that some of the cities in Donetsk and Lugansk region now it's under the control of the Russia. It's Ukrainian armies just need to define and need to stay more powerful, you know, to fight against the Russian army in this region. Also, you mentioned on Tuesday, the White House and make the agreement, and we say the $700 million, you know, with weapon, you know, to help Ukraine in this region. We appreciate, you know, from Joe Biden and also for the support of by the America to Ukraine. But why the Russians try, you know, to destroy the Ukrainian railway hubs, even though, you know, to close the way that this weapon can, you know, join the army in these regions, but it's difficult to get there. I mean, the Kherson and the Donetsk and Lugansk, it's so difficult, you know, even for the volunteers to send the food, to send the humanitarian aid to this region. It's difficult to get there. That's why they tried, you know, to destroy these places like the Zhytomyr region, Korostain, the other cities in like Malin, in the other places, you know, to more difficult to get there. Actually, due to latest information was given by Alexei Arestovich, one of the advisors to Ukrainian president, they said that city of Severodonetsk now is under the control of the Russians because Ukrainian forces was back to Lysychansk, you know, to defend the city. But actually, we will see in next few days what will be the situation in this region, and also we are waiting for this military support given by European allies and American allies to Ukraine. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of European, let's say, assistance and American deal or Biden's deal, it seems that it concerns only 4 systems. And here we have Mr. Hali Schlanger, who can tell us more about the deal, which includes only 4 systems and which came with strings attached. So was still weeks away from being operational, that is. And I mean, Biden has made clear that he will not allow catastrophic failure of Ukrainian defenses, but it is just as evident he has concerns about the implications of catastrophic success. That is a route of Russian forces with the decisive help of Western weapons, bringing with it the danger of a defeated Putin lashing out. In addition to that, the French President Emmanuel Macron is admitting that the Western nations failed on dealing with Russia appropriately, and he underlines that they should not humiliate Russia. What's your reading on this, Mr. Schlanger?
Well, I think we have to start with the reason this was launched in the first place, which is hardly ever mentioned by Ukrainian officials, which is that for 8 years, the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian volunteer militia were pounding the civilian population in the Donbass. And that's what Putin was insisting that the West must deal with. No more attacks from the Ukrainian military on the people of Lugansk and Donetsk. The Ukrainian government signed an agreement, the Minsk agreement, that they would negotiate, but they never did. So I think when people say it's all Russia, you have to look at the responsibility of the Ukrainian government for not negotiating in good faith. Mm-hmm. Now, secondly, the continual flow of arms to Ukraine is the reason the war is continuing. The Russians had no intention of taking Kiev. The story that the Russians lost the Battle of Kiev, listen to what Putin said from the beginning, what the Russian military said from the beginning. Their goal was to denazify Ukraine, was to demilitarize Ukraine, and to create a situation for Ukraine to be neutral, with security guarantees for both Russia and for Ukraine. The fight now is to ensure that the people of the Donetsk and Luhansk region and the Donbass are protected. Now, the United States is in a very difficult situation because if we provide more advanced offensive weapons that can reach from Ukraine into Russia, then that makes the United States a co-belligerent. And then we're in World War III. Biden is very worried about that. So is the U.S. military. But there are some in the United States Congress that are saying we should get into that. And I think that's the real danger. I would like to see a negotiated settlement take place quickly. Both sides adopt a ceasefire and stop the fighting. Then you can negotiate the longer-term relationship of the Donbass to Ukraine and to Russia. But as long as the arms pour in, the money pours in, the Ukrainians will keep fighting. And I'm afraid the West is responsible for the damage that's being done to the country of Ukraine.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Mykolai Volkevsky, perhaps you would like to comment on what our distinguished guest just stated. And it is underlined that it is expected that the war to be protracted as the issues at stake are existential and not susceptible to compromise. Western support will give Ukraine the means to keep fighting, but both sides will struggle to win a decisive victory. At the same time, it seems that the sanctions implemented against Russia are indeed backfiring on the West as a whole, and the US in particular, no exception. And many analysts concurred that much social unrest is expected within Western countries as well. How do you read this?
Oh, it's like we just back from a World Economic Forum in Davos. It was a lot of negotiations about how this war will proceed, on when is the Ukrainian side gonna make some treaty agreement or negotiate between Russia. I just try to remind that Ukraine started to have the negotiations with Russia then 29th or 28th of February, after 4 days when Russia invaded Ukraine. In Belarus, it was the first mistake for Ukrainian side, to accept this kind of negotiation on the territory of Belarus, to not legitimate, a government of Lukashenko. And after that, we had some conversation also we had some peace talks with the Russia side, with Lavrov, between Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs in Ankara during the diplomatic summit. I don't know actually how they keep, to proceed those kind of peace talk negotiations. But first of all, the Ukrainian President Zelensky mentioned before that we tried to continue with what is tied to this negotiation. Just on the main issue, Ukraine needs to receive back the territory which was given to Ukraine due to independence, 1991. I mean, the Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk. But now I don't know how it will be possible in the real situation. More and more people try to use this term political realism for real situation which is going on in Ukraine. And after that, they propose, to provide some peace talks, like the European leaders, even Emmanuel Macron. He's on both sides. He all the time in touch with Vladimir Putin, and all the time he's in touch with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He tried to be a mediator, uses conversations between Russia and Ukraine. I don't know how these European leaders are going to provide this kind of conversation between the Russia, but I heard some information that in the nearly future, the leaders of Italy, Draghi, Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron going to meet with President Zelensky or some of their advisors, with President Putin in the nearly future. I don't know about what they would like, to talk, but main things, it's, that Sir Professor just mentioned it, the Minsk agreements. But some of the proposed, it will be the third part of this Minsk agreements. But from the Ukrainian side, all the time it was accepted. It's a kind of Minsk agreement due to the text, due to all of the articles. But after that, the Russia, just tried to enter Ukraine after this conversation, which was provided between NATO and Russia. For example, in 16th of January, just 1 month before the Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia started war in our country. For me, I expect this kind of talks or bilateral meetings between the two countries, maybe in September. After three months, I don't know, maybe it will be earlier, but we will see which kind of basics or which kind of talks they're going to provide it from the Russian and Ukrainian side of the future. Thank you so much, sir.
Mr. Hali Schlinger, how do you see a peace deal here? Does a peace deal mean that Ukraine is going to lose more of its territory?
I think that's the result of not taking the Minsk negotiations seriously. Remember, Ukraine did sign the Minsk agreement, but the Germans and the French never enforced them carrying through with it. Now, if you want to go back further, as your other guest brought up some events from 1991, NATO had promised, the West had promised Russia no eastward expansion. That was a promise made by President Bush, by Chancellor Kohl of Germany and Mitterrand of France and even Thatcher of Great Britain. No further eastward expansion of NATO. and yet NATO has moved 1,000 kilometers closer to the Russian border. So when Putin urged a discussion of security guarantees back in 2007, from then to 2022, nothing was done except more countries added to NATO. So how do you get a peace agreement in this situation? I think it's unrealistic now to say that the Russians would pull back from the territory that's been taken in the Donbass. The declaration of an independent republic of Lugansk and Donetsk, well, will they be incorporated into Russia or not? The question is, what security guarantees are there that NATO won't be bringing more offensive weapons into Ukraine? I will point out that the United States should remember what happened in 1962 when the Soviets put offensive weapons, nuclear weapons, in Cuba. And President Kennedy took the world to the brink of war to tell the Russians, get these bombs out, get these nuclear missiles out, or we will fight you, we'll conquer, we'll move into Cuba. And at that time, the chairman of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, pulled the missiles out. And that was considered legitimate defense by the United States. When Russia raises the question of the possibility of NATO advanced weapons or nuclear weapons on its border in Ukraine, it's somehow considered Putin's being irrational. I think this idea of security guarantees is what's necessary. What the Schiller Institute is calling for is a full convention of all major nations, but centered around the United States, NATO, Russia, and China, to reach new security guarantees, a new security architecture, not a world divided into blocks of East versus West, North, South, NATO versus Russia, but where all nations' security is taken for granted, including Ukraine.
Very nice indeed. Moving on, and in a game of diplomatic cat and mouse, Russia and the West are coming up with similar, if sometimes competing ideas for how Ukraine's badly needed grain can be given safe passage through the Black Sea and onto the world markets. Turkey, as a second strongest power in the NATO members, is playing an important role in guaranteeing security for the grain exports from the Ukrainian ports, as Turkey owns a longshore with in the Black Sea, that is. Very nice indeed. Since you brought the diplomatic efforts and the peace negotiation, Mr. Mykola Volkievsky, do you think that Turkey will indeed make a progress during the upcoming meeting with Russia?
Of course, we expected the official visit of Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov in 8th of June to Ankara. You know, I don't know which kind of negotiations will be provided from the Russia side and Turkey, but we understand that now as in Turkey on the middle. They try to mediate this process. I just try to remind you, sir, that Recep Erdogan proposed to be a mediator between Turkey, between Ukraine and Russia in Bishkek in 28th of October. It was like his prediction, which kind of situation gonna happen in the near future, I mean the war. That's why he provided negotiations in Ankara, it provided in Istanbul. This kind of talks between the United Nations, to fight the food crisis, it's a way. Even from the latest interview of Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey. For me, I prefer this kind of mediation when it's Belarus one was provided in early March and late February. But we will see which kind of talks will be or which kind of agreements will be seen between the two sides in Turkey and Russia in 8th of June, and how it will be possible to nearly future to meet between Erdogan and Putin, between Erdogan and Volodymyr Zelensky, because we know these Ukrainian, the Turkey all the time, they was, support Ukraine. They all the time, they made a lot of, agreements to support our country. They sent Ukraine Bayraktars. For this reason, we totally support this Turkish side. But actually, it's interesting because Turkey tried, to help Ukraine from the Black Sea, from the grain, to fight the food crisis. From this reason, I totally accept this kind of negotiations. We will see what will be the result. But for me, it's a positive way, to fix all of these issues in the food. Thank you, sir.
Very nice. Mr. Hali Schlenger, if negotiations here fail and both countries won't reach a deal, do you think that the world can replace Ukrainian grain supplies? And what would be the alternative?
Well, first of all, I think it's very likely that what the Turkish government intends, and the Russians as well, is that there will be an agreement to allow grain to be shipped. But the food shortage internationally predated the Russian operation against Ukraine. We've been warning about this. The World Food Program of the United Nations has been warning about this for a long time because of the sanctions policy. It's the sanctions against countries like Afghanistan and against Yemen and against Libya and Iraq and Syria that have added to the world food crisis. Additionally, by limiting the access to Russian oil and gas and also Russian fertilizer, that's increasing the crisis. Now, the question that comes up then is, what will the Europeans do? Because I live in Germany, and I can see the effects already. The inflation, the cost of gas at the pump, the food costs are skyrocketing. And in some cases, butter is up 30%, eggs are up 40%. This is in a very wealthy country, Germany. But the cutting off of the oil from Russia, the sanctions policies overall, is having a profound effect in Europe. And the German economics minister, Habeck, warned that there will be social unrest in Germany in September, but he said that's a price we have to pay to fight for freedom and democracy. I don't agree with that. I think we can get a negotiated settlement between Russia and Ukraine. We can solve the food crisis, but we can't solve it if we have governments that are shutting down energy production, the so-called green policy, the so-called IMF conditionalities against poor countries. So it's a much bigger problem, the food problem, than just Ukraine and Russia. And I think that's an important point to make. And countries in Africa have a role to play. They're being hurt by loss of fertilizer and other kinds of goods, but the African countries under the IMF ship an enormous amount of food to Europe and don't get enough payment
and
for
speaking
it.
of African countries, allow me here to interrupt you, Mr. Hali Schlanger. In a related context, the Senegalese president and the chairman of the African Union, Macky Sall, along with Moussa Faki Mahamat, chairman of the AU Commission, headed to the southern Russian city of Sochi to meet with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. There, Mr. Putin denied Moscow was preventing Ukrainian ports from exporting grain and said the best solution would be to ship it through Belarus as long as sanctions on that country were lifted. Let's follow this report and we get back to discussion.
In the last couple of months, he was constantly blamed for the current global food crisis, but this did not prevent the Russian President Vladimir Putin from proposing several solutions to export cereals blocked in Ukraine because of the conflict. In one of his few appearances these days, he blamed the West instead and denied Moscow had imposed a ban on grain exports from Ukrainian ports. The situation will worsen because the British and Americans have imposed sanctions on our fertilizers, says the Russian president.
The situation will worsen because the British and Americans have imposed sanctions on our fertilizers. And then when they realize what's happening, Americans lifted the sanctions, but Europeans chose not to. In direct talks with me, they're saying that something needs to be done. But today they only made things worse by imposing a sixth package of sanctions. It will worsen the situation on the global fertilizers market. This means that the plans on the harvest will be much more modest, and prices will only grow further. It's absolutely short-sighted, erroneous, and I can say, just dumb policy.
In the southern Russian city of Sochi, he warmly welcomed the Senegalese president and the chairman of the African Union, Macky Sall, along with Moussa Faki Mahamat, chairman of the African Union Commission. But coming from a continent where an estimated of 282 million people already aren't getting enough to eat, both leaders needed that Mr. Putin realize that Africans are victims of the war in Ukraine. The president of the African Union, however, said he was reassured at the end of his meeting with the Russian president.
We are reassured and very happy with our meeting. Now everything is not done. We must continue the discussion with the other partners so that trade can resume immediately.
African countries are acutely affected by the growing crisis, which has sent prices of grains, cooking oils, fuel and fertilizers soaring. Russia has said it is ready to allow vessels carrying food to leave Ukraine in return for the lifting of some sanctions, a proposal that Ukraine has described as blackmail.
Let me get back to you on this, Mr. Harley Schlanger. Kremlin officials are claiming that Western sanctions on Russia were responsible for rising global food prices, despite experts agreeing that Russia's blockade of Ukrainian grain leaving the country's ports is largely to blame. Putin has made the same accusation himself multiple times. Do you think that this is part of an effort to get sanctions on Russia lifted?
Well, first of all, I think the report you just showed was a very accurate report, and that what Putin was saying was true. The sanctions have definitely hurt countries in the poorer parts of the world, combined with what I mentioned earlier, the International Monetary Fund conditionalities, which makes those countries sell the food they produce. The poorer countries sell the food they produce to Europe while they're shutting down farms in Europe. So the sanctions policy, the agriculture policy in the West as a whole is a big part of this problem. Now, it also should be noted that the Ukrainians mined some of the ports that made it difficult for ships to go through. I think those mines have now been removed by the Russians. But you know, the blame game is a big part of the problem. We have to get to solutions, and the solutions start with the point that Western policy of sanctions, in my view, is a war crime. Afghanistan, for example, people are starving there because the money was stolen by the banks. That was the Afghan government's money. We're seeing the sanctions in Yemen, which are leading to mass starvation and hunger among children. In East Africa, the same thing. And that's why governments like Senegal, Egypt, Nigeria, also the Algerian government, have refused to support the sanctions demanded by the West against Russia. So I think this is a valid point that Putin is making. Sanctions are not a way to conduct policy.
And in that case scenario, how long do you think the sanctions will last or will remain in place? Is it indefinitely? And if so, can we say that Russia's economy will decouple from the West? Commodity supply chains will have to adjust to the loss of Russian imports, and the wider region will be subject to long-term instability, Mr. Harley Schlanger?
Well, I think the U.S. intends to keep these sanctions even after there's a diplomatic agreement between Russia and Ukraine. Because as Lloyd Austin said at Ramstein Air Base, the goal is to weaken Russia. As Biden said in Warsaw, it's to end the Putin era, that is regime change in Russia. So I don't think the NATO, US, British leadership intends to lift the sanctions. They see this as using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. At the same time, they're moving toward doing the same against China in the East. So the problem here is the Western policies. They make no sense. And that's why I said at the outset, I see Ukraine as a victim, not of Russia, but of its own government being supported and completely defended by NATO and the United States.
I would like to hear perhaps the take of Mykola Volkivsky on what you just commented, and also raising the issue of the food shortage, which is particularly devastating in several African and Middle Eastern countries, which have historically relied on Russia and Ukraine for their food imports. Western nations have accused Putin of holding the world at ransom by not lifting the blockade of Ukraine's ports and leading to rising inflation around the globe. Don't you think that Westerners are the ones provoking Putin? For instance, earlier last week, the White House bluntly rejected the latest offer from Moscow. If the US and its partners will only lift the sanctions, Moscow will take steps to prevent what experts warn could be a devastating global food crisis. Don't you think that Westerners are not trying to find a solution, and that hunger is being now used as a weapon in the Ukraine war, Mr. Mykola Volkivsky?
I try to say that it was sanctions. It was one of what we expected with Russia invade Ukraine on 24th of February. Because of the sanctions, they helped the Ukrainian. But something which we expected, that Putin is trying to find the other partners and solutions, even for Africa region. Like, for example, I try to remind you just like 1 week ago, we have just already met with the Prime Minister or President of Senegal in Dakar, like last week. Also, all of this, I just try to say the truth that due to satellites, a lot of Ukrainians' grains was stolen by the Russia, and also to Sevastopol harbor. So Sevastopol of Crimea, it's a lot of trucks just moving, from the Ukrainian side, from Ukrainian city, which is under the occupation now in Kherson region. For example, in Melitopol, it's a lot of places, what the ground was just stolen from Ukrainian farmers. It's a big problem because they're doing not clearly, just steal Ukrainian grain and Ukrainians agriculture. It's a big problem. I don't know actually how to expect, why is this food crisis will proceed or not, but we are trying, to be also in touch. It's thankfully for like we already mentioned, the Turkey, they tried, to help the fight against the food crisis in the country, because even we tried, to open the new corridor, to Romania, to proceed and send the grains or like a corn, because a lot of farmers have already a lot of, inside his farm, a lot of this agriculture. And the reason, actually, we don't know how will be the next steps will be provided by the sanctions. But sanctions, from my side, the economic sanctions against Russia was like positively on the first moment, on the first month of the war between Russia and Ukraine.
Understood.
Actually, how the world will react of this food crisis, or the World Food Foundation on the United Nations will proceed this kind of conversation. We will see, teacher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mykola Volkiewski. Mr. Harley Schlanger, thank you so much for your thorough analysis. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. We have reached the end of our debate show. Bye for now.